The world of the Middle Ages was loud and smelly. We often forget the smelly part. But smell was everywhere. It was a constant presence in a way we can hardly imagine today. Our modern world is sanitized. We have plumbing, garbage collection, and air fresheners. They had none of that. Their relationship with odors, both good and bad, was much more immediate. To understand how they dealt with bad smells, we first have to understand where those smells came from. The sources were many, and they were relentless. Let's start in the city. A medieval city like London or Paris was crowded. The streets were narrow and unpaved. When it rained, they turned into thick mud. When it was dry, they were dusty, but mud and dust were the least of the problems. The real issue was waste. There was no regular trash pickup. People threw their household garbage right into the street. This included food scraps, broken pottery, old rags, and anything else they needed to get rid of. The street was the town's garbage can. Animals would pick through it. Pigs, dogs, and chickens roamed freely, eating what they could find and leaving their own droppings behind. Then there was human waste. Most people used a chamber pot at night. In the morning, they had to empty it. The common practice was to simply toss the contents out the window into the street below. People would shout a warning, but accidents happened. This waste mixed with the mud, garbage, and animal droppings. It created a foul-smelling soup in the streets, especially in the poorer quarters. Some houses had privies, which were basically small outhouses. These often hung over the street or a river. A privy might be just a wooden seat over a pit. When the pit, called a cesspit, was full, it had to be emptied. This was a job for a specialized worker, sometimes called a gong farmer. They worked at night, digging out the waste and carting it away to be used as fertilizer on fields outside the city. It was a disgusting and dangerous job. The fumes could be deadly. Wealthier homes and castles were a little better, but not by much. A castle might have a garderobe. This was a small room with a stone or wooden seat that had a hole. The hole opened straight down the side of the castle wall into the moat or a pit. It offered privacy but did little to contain the smell, especially on a warm day. The moat around a castle wasn't the clear, beautiful water we see in movies. It was often a stagnant, stinking ditch filled with sewage and garbage. It was part of the defense, but it also contributed to the overall stench. Beyond personal waste, there was industrial waste. Certain trades were known for being incredibly smelly. Tanners were among the worst. To tan leather, they had to treat animal hides. This process involved scraping off flesh and fat, then soaking the hides in vats of foul liquids. They often used urine, which they collected in pots left outside their shops, or even dog droppings to soften the leather. The smell of a tannery was overpowering. It was a mix of rotting flesh, chemicals, and ammonia. The butchers were another source of odor. They slaughtered animals in their shops or in the street. The blood would run into the gutters. They tossed leftover bones, fat, and entrails into the street for the dogs and pigs. The dyers also created strong smells. They used substances like lichen and woad to color cloth, and the vats they used gave off powerful chemical odors. These trades were essential, but people hated living near them. Often, towns would pass laws forcing the smelliest trades to operate in a specific area, usually downwind or near a river where they could wash their waste away. Even the rivers were not spared. A river flowing through a city was a public sewer. All the waste from the streets, from the tanneries and butcher shops, from the privies hanging over its banks, ended up in the water. People still used this water for washing, and sometimes even for drinking, which led to terrible diseases. The water itself would have been murky and foul. Personal hygiene was also very different. Bathing was not a daily habit for most people. Water had to be hauled by hand and heated over a fire, which was a lot of work. Soap existed, but it was often harsh and made from animal fat and lye. It was not something everyone could afford or use regularly. People washed their hands and faces, but a full body bath might happen only a few times a year. The poor might only bathe in a river during the summer. This meant the smell of unwashed bodies was common. Sweat, dirt, and bacteria created a distinct human odor that was just part of life. People wore wool and linen clothing that was not washed as frequently as our clothes are today. These fabrics would have held onto the smells of sweat, smoke from cooking fires, and the general environment. Sickness and death also had their own smells. Without modern medicine, infections were common. A wound could fester, and the smell of rot and decay was a sign that death was near. In times of plague, the problem was magnified 1,000 times. The streets would be filled with the dead and dying. The smell of death was a constant reminder of the fragility of life. Churches were often a source of bad smells, too. People were buried under the church floor, and as the bodies decomposed, the smell could seep up through the flagstones. The more important and wealthy you were, the closer you were buried to the altar. The air in a crowded church could be thick with the smells of incense, candle wax, unwashed bodies, and the faint, sweet smell of decay from below. It is hard for us to truly comprehend this world of smells. It was a constant assault on the nose. But it was their reality. They were born into it. A person's sense of smell was likely more acute and more important than ours. Smell was information. It told you if food was rotten. It warned you that you were near a tannery. It signaled disease. They didn't have the option to simply eliminate these smells. So they had to find ways to live with them, to mask them, and to fight them as best they could. Their methods were a mix of practicality, superstition, and a deep desire for a moment of sweet smelling relief. Living in a world full of bad smells, medieval people became masters of masking them. Since they couldn't easily eliminate the source of a stench, they focused on controlling their immediate personal environment. They wanted their own bodies, their clothes, and the air right around them to smell pleasant. This was not just about comfort. A good smell was a sign of wealth, status, and even good health. The rich, in particular, went to great lengths to surround themselves with fragrant perfumes and herbs. One of the most iconic tools against bad smells was the pomander. A pomander was a small ball, often made of silver or gold, that was filled with aromatic substances. The name comes from the French pomme d'ambre, meaning apple of amber. The ball was often ornately decorated and perforated with small holes to let the scent escape. A wealthy man or woman would carry a pomander on a chain hanging from their belt or around their neck. When they encountered a particularly bad smell, like walking past a butcher's stall, they would lift the pomander to their nose and inhale deeply. It was a personal, portable air freshener. The ingredients inside a pomander were expensive and often exotic. The most common base was ambergris. Ambergris is a waxy substance produced in the digestive system of sperm whales. It washes up on shores and was incredibly valuable. It has a complex, earthy, and sweet scent, and more importantly, it's a fixative. That means it absorbs other scents and makes them last much longer. Other key ingredients were musk, from the glands of the musk deer, and civet, from the civet cat. These animal scents are powerful and pungent on their own, but in small amounts, they add a deep, lasting quality to a perfume. To these bases, they would add a mix of ground spices like cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg, dried flowers like lavender and roses, and fragrant resins like frankincense and myrrh. The recipe for a pomander was a closely guarded secret for some perfumers. Owning a beautiful pomander filled with expensive ingredients was a clear statement that you were a person of high social standing. Clothing itself was a vehicle for pleasant smells. People would place small bags or sachets filled with dried herbs and flowers in their chests and wardrobes. Lavender was a favorite, as were rose petals and chamomile. This would keep the clothes from smelling musty and impart a subtle fragrance. Wealthy people had their clothes washed with scented water, perhaps with rose water or orange flower water. Fine leather gloves were a fashion accessory, and they were often perfumed. The process involved rubbing the leather with fragrant oils and pastes, infusing the material with a scent that could last for months. To wear perfumed gloves was another sign of luxury. Personal hygiene, while not up to modern standards, was not completely absent. People did value cleanliness. Bathing was more common among the rich, who might have a wooden tub in a private chamber. A servant would haul buckets of hot water to fill it. It was a luxury. To make the experience more pleasant and to scent the skin, they would add herbs and flowers to the bath water. Rosemary, mint, and sage were common choices. After bathing, a person might use a scented water or oil on their skin and hair. Rose water was extremely popular. It was made by distilling rose petals and was used as a light perfume, a skin toner, and even a flavoring for food. Public bathhouses, known as stews, existed in many towns. They offered hot baths to those who couldn't afford a private tub. These places were social hubs. You could get a bath, a meal, and maybe a haircut. However, over time, they gained a bad reputation and became associated with prostitution and immoral behavior. The church often spoke out against them. The fear of disease also played a role. During the Black Death, many public bathhouses were closed because people believed that opening the pores of the skin with hot water made one more vulnerable to the bad air that supposedly carried the plague. Oral hygiene was also a concern. People didn't have toothbrushes or toothpaste, but they did try to combat bad breath. They would chew on certain herbs to freshen their mouths. Parsley was a common choice, as were cloves and mint leaves. They would also make mouthwashes by steeping herbs like rosemary or mint in wine or water. They would rub their teeth and gums with a rough linen cloth, sometimes with a powder made from crushed herbs or even bone. It wasn't perfect, but it shows they were aware of the problem and tried to solve it with the resources they had. It is important to remember the class divide in all of this. A wealthy noblewoman had access to pomanders, perfumed gloves, and private baths filled with rose petals. She could afford to surround herself with a bubble of pleasant smells. A poor peasant, on the other hand, had very different priorities. Their main concern was survival. They worked hard in the fields, and the smell of sweat and earth was the smell of their life. They might use some simple, locally grown herbs to freshen their small cottage or their clothes, like lavender or thyme, but they could not afford imported spices or ambergris. Their world smelled of wood smoke, livestock, and hard labor. The ability to smell good was a luxury, a way to separate the rich from the poor. The scent you carried with you was a part of your identity. It told the world who you were, or at least who you could afford to be. It was a constant, invisible marker of your place in the social order. Just as people tried to control their personal scent, they also fought a constant battle against bad smells in their homes. A medieval home, whether it was a grand castle or a simple peasant cottage, was a collection of strong odors. The smell of cooking fires, food, animals, and unwashed bodies all mingled in the air. Keeping these smells at bay, or at least covering them up, was a part of daily life. The methods they used were clever and made use of the natural world around them. One of the most common and effective techniques was the use of strewing herbs. This meant scattering fresh or dried plants across the floor. In a wealthy home with stone or tile floors, and even in a peasant's hut with a simple packed earth floor, this was standard practice. The main material used was rushes, a type of long grass-like plant that grew in wetlands. They would be cut, dried, and laid down in a thick layer. This created a softer, warmer surface to walk on than bare earth or cold stone. But its most important job was to manage smells and mess. The rushes acted like a giant disposable air freshener and sponge. Spilled food, drink, and grease would be absorbed by the rushes instead of staining the floor. Or people would spit, and dogs would have accidents. The rushes caught it all. To combat the smells that would inevitably arise from this, sweet-smelling herbs were mixed in with the rushes. Lavender, chamomile, mint, marjoram, and meadowsweet were popular choices. When people walked across the floor, the herbs would be crushed underfoot, releasing their pleasant fragrance into the air. This constant gentle scent helped to mask the underlying odors of the room. When the layer of rushes and herbs became too dirty and smelly, it wasn't always completely removed. Often, a new fresh layer was simply thrown on top of the old one. This could lead to a thick, compacted mat of filth on the floor that, over time, created its own unique and powerful smell. A thorough cleaning, where all the old rushes were carted out, might only happen once or twice a year. Another powerful tool against bad smells was fire and smoke. Almost every home had a central hearth or a fireplace for cooking and heating. People quickly realized they could burn things that produced a pleasant smoke. Fragrant woods like apple or juniper might be chosen for the fire. They also burned incense. While we often associate incense with churches, it was widely used in wealthy homes as well. Resins like frankincense and myrrh, which were imported from the Middle East and were very expensive, would be burned on hot coals in a special container called a censer. The thick, aromatic smoke would fill the room, overpowering other smells. This was especially important when entertaining guests or during times of sickness, when it was believed that the perfumed smoke could purify the air and ward off disease. Homes were also designed, sometimes unintentionally, to have a lot of airflow. Windows were often just openings in the wall with wooden shutters, not glass. This meant that even when closed, they were not airtight. Castles and large manor houses were notoriously drafty. While this made them cold in the winter, it also meant there was a constant circulation of fresh air that helped to carry away bad smells. Simply opening the shutters to let a breeze blow through the room was a simple but effective way to freshen the air. And cleanliness played a role, though their idea of clean was different from ours. Surfaces might be wiped down, floors would be swept. They used cleaning agents made from natural ingredients. Lye, made from wood ash, was a powerful soap that could be used for scrubbing. They also used vinegar as a disinfectant and cleaning agent. Sand was sometimes used as an abrasive to scour pots and pans, but the fight against dirt and grime was endless, and they lacked the tools and understanding of germs that we have today. The area immediately outside the home was also important. Many homes had a small garden. This wasn't just for growing vegetables. It was also an herb garden, a physic garden for medicinal plants, and a flower garden. These gardens were often placed right outside a window or door. The scent of roses, lilies, lavender, and rosemary would drift into the house on a warm breeze. A woman might bring cut flowers or herbs inside and place them in a vase of water to perfume a room. The kitchen, in particular, was a source of both good and bad smells. The aroma of baking bread or roasting meat was a welcome one. But the smell of food waste was not. A good household would have a compost pit or a designated spot away from the house to dump kitchen scraps. In the grandest households, special attention was paid to the linens. Bedding, tablecloths, and towels were stored in wooden chests with sachets of dried herbs. They were washed with scented soap and rinsed in water infused with flowers. This was a mark of a well-run and prosperous home. When you sat down to a meal at a lord's table, the clean, fragrant linen was part of the experience, a stark contrast to the smells of the street you had just left behind. All these methods show a conscious effort to improve the domestic environment. They understood that their world was smelly, and they used the resources available to them to create small pockets of pleasantness. A room filled with the scent of lavender from the floor, frankincense from the fire, and roses from the garden was a sanctuary. It was a temporary escape from the harsh olfactory reality of the medieval world. It was a way of using nature to fight back against the less pleasant side of life. The medieval struggle against bad smells was not just about personal comfort or making a home pleasant. It was a matter of life and death. People in the Middle Ages were terrified of disease, and for good reason. Sicknesses like dysentery, typhoid, and most terrifying of all, the bubonic plague could sweep through a population and kill thousands. They did not understand germ theory. They couldn't see the bacteria and viruses that were the true culprits. So, they developed their own explanation for how disease spread. This was the miasma theory. The miasma theory was the belief that diseases were caused by miasma, which literally means bad air. This bad air was thought to rise from rotting organic matter, from swamps, from cesspits, and from the bodies of the sick and the dead. It was a poisonous vapor, a corrupting fog that you could often identify by its foul smell. To a medieval person, a bad smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was a physical threat. If you could smell the stench of a swamp or a garbage pile, you were inhaling the very thing that could make you sick. The smell itself was the disease, or at least the carrier of it. This theory, while incorrect about the mechanism, actually led them to some surprisingly effective public health practices. Since bad smells were believed to cause disease, the logical conclusion was that getting rid of bad smells would prevent disease. This spurred the first attempts at civic sanitation and urban planning. It was a fight against filth driven by fear. Town and city councils began to pass laws aimed at cleaning up the streets. They knew that the piles of garbage and pools of sewage were not just ugly and smelly, but dangerous. In London, for example, records show numerous regulations against littering. People were fined for dumping their chamber pots in the street instead of carrying the waste to a designated collection point or to the river. There were rules about where butchers could slaughter their animals and how they had to dispose of the blood and offal. Smelly industries like tanning and dyeing were often restricted to specific neighborhoods, usually on the edge of town or downwind, to protect the majority of citizens from their noxious fumes. To enforce these rules, cities employed officials. There were street cleaners, sometimes called rakers, whose job was to scrape the filth from the main thoroughfares and cart it away. There were surveyors who inspected rivers and streams to make sure they were not being illegally blocked or polluted by businesses. The previously mentioned gong farmers who cleaned out cesspits were performing a vital public health service by removing a major source of miasma. These were not glamorous jobs, but they were essential to the functioning and health of the city. The connection between smell and health was strongest during an outbreak of plague. When the Black Death struck, doctors and officials worked frantically to combat the corrupt air. They believed the plague was a particularly potent miasma that had drifted in from distant lands. To fight it, they used strong, pleasant smells. It was a form of aromatic warfare. Physicians would wear beak-like masks, the iconic image of the plague doctor. The beak of the mask was stuffed with powerful aromatic herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked sponges. The doctor would breathe through this mixture, believing it would filter out the deadly miasma before it could enter his body. During a plague, cities would order large bonfires to be lit in the streets. They burned aromatic woods like juniper and pine. The idea was that the thick, clean smoke would purify the air and drive away the pestilence. People were advised to carry their own personal anti-miasma devices. They would hold pomanders to their noses, or simply a handful of fragrant herbs or a cloth soaked in vinegar. They would burn incense in their homes and avoid crowded places where the air was thought to be stagnant and corrupt. They would ring church bells loudly, believing the vibrations could help break up and disperse the poisonous air. This focus on air quality extended to the design of buildings and the location of towns. A wealthy person building a new manor house would choose a location carefully. They would look for a spot on a hill where the breezes were strong and could carry away any bad air. They would avoid low-lying marshy ground, as swamps were known to be a source of foul smells and the fevers we now know as malaria. The belief was that a healthy home was one with good, clean, fresh-smelling air. The church played a major role in this fight as well. The heavy use of incense during religious services was not just symbolic. It was a practical way to combat the odors of a large, tightly packed crowd of unwashed people. In a time of sickness, the amount of incense burned would increase dramatically. The fragrant smoke was seen as a form of spiritual and physical cleansing, a way to create a bubble of holy, safe air inside the church that could protect the congregation from the dangers outside. While the miasma theory was wrong about the cause of disease, it wasn't entirely useless. By trying to eliminate bad smells, they were inadvertently cleaning up the sources of bacteria. Cleaning filth from the streets reduced the number of flies which carry disease. Removing human waste from cesspits helped protect the water supply from contamination. Forcing tanners and butchers to operate away from residential areas reduced people's contact with animal waste and rotting flesh. Their reasoning was flawed, but some of their actions had positive results. They were practicing a basic form of sanitation and environmental health, not because they understood germs, but because they trusted their noses. A bad smell was a warning sign from the world, and they learned to pay attention to it. So, with all this filth, disease, and overwhelming odor, were medieval people just constantly miserable? Did they walk around every day with their noses wrinkled in disgust? It's easy for us to look back and imagine their world as a kind of smelly, primitive nightmare. But that's probably not how they saw it. Their experience of the world was different from ours. Their entire sensory landscape, especially their sense of smell, was tuned to a different frequency. Living with the smell was a matter of acceptance and adaptation. First, there's the simple fact of habituation. The human brain is very good at filtering out constant background information. If you live next to a busy road, you eventually stop hearing the traffic. If you work in a coffee shop, you stop noticing the smell of coffee after a while. For a person born and raised in a medieval city, the complex mix of smells from the street, the animals, and the workshops was just the normal smell of home. It was the background scent of their life. It wouldn't have registered as constantly offensive in the way it would to us, a visitor from a sanitized future. A particularly strong or unusual smell would get their attention, but the general odor was just part of the atmosphere. Smell was also a vital source of information. In a world without refrigeration or expiration dates, your nose was your best tool for survival. The smell of meat turning bad, of milk souring, or of bread growing mold was an unmistakable warning not to eat something. The smell of smoke could mean a warm hearth, or it could mean a dangerous fire. A farmer could smell the air and predict rain. A doctor might try to diagnose an illness based on the scent of a patient's breath or sweat. Smells were not just good or bad, they were signals that provided crucial data about the world. The smell of a tannery wasn't pleasant, but it told you that leather goods were being made nearby. The smell of a bakery meant fresh bread was available. Their world of smells was richer and more detailed than ours because they had to pay more attention to it. Furthermore, smells were deeply tied to social status. As we've seen, the wealthy could afford to surround themselves with pleasant fragrances. Spices, incense, and perfumes were expensive luxury goods imported from far away. To smell of cloves and ambergris was a sign that you were powerful and rich. It was a way of creating a scented wall between yourself and the common people. Conversely, the smell of honest labor, of sweat, soil, manure, or fish was the smell of the working class. There was no shame in it. It was simply the reality of their lives. A person's scent was part of their identity. You could likely tell a person's trade or social standing just by the way they smelled. We should also not forget that their world contained many wonderful smells that we have lost. Imagine the scent of a real wood fire in every home, not the artificial scented candles we use today. Think of the smell of beeswax candles in a church, or the intense fragrance of a field of wildflowers uninterrupted by chemical pesticides. The smell of freshly baked bread from a wood-fired oven, of horses, of leather, of wet wool by the fire, these were all part of their daily experience. Their olfactory world was not just worse, it was stronger, more intense, and more varied. They experienced the full spectrum of odors, from the most foul to the most sublime, in a way that we rarely do. Their acceptance of these smells was also tied to their understanding of the world. They saw processes of decay and regeneration as natural parts of life, ordained by God. Manure was smelly, but it was essential for fertilizing the fields that grew their food. Death and decay were sad and frightening, but they were an inevitable part of the cycle of life and a prelude to resurrection. They didn't have the modern expectation that the world should be perfectly clean, orderly, and odorless. They accepted a level of messiness and decay as part of the natural order of things. So, while medieval people certainly recognized and disliked bad smells, their relationship with them was complex. They fought them with herbs and perfumes. They legislated against them out of a fear of disease. But they also lived with them, they adapted. Their noses were trained to navigate a world of intense odors, to extract information, to identify status, and to find comfort in the good smells that punctuated their lives. To judge their world by our modern sensory standards is to miss the point. It wasn't a failed, smelly version of our world. It was a different world entirely, one that engaged all the senses, especially the sense of smell, in a much more direct and powerful way. They lived in a reality where smell was not just an afterthought, but a fundamental part of existence.